The first time James Holloway saw Milo the cub was curled up in the hollow of a concrete drain on the edge of a burnt-out village in northern Iraq. It was 2 a.m., the air thick with dust gun oil, and that heavy silence soldiers learned to breathe. James was checking perimeter routes alone when his flashlight caught two amber eyes peering from the darkness, not wide with fear, but narrow, observant. Watching. Waiting. At first he thought it was a jackal, but then the shape shifted. Broad shoulders, thick paws, short tail, smaller than a coyote but stockier. A wild cat baby, a bobcat, lost, barely weaned, and surrounded by the detritus of war. James lowered his weapon and crouched. He didn't speak, just watched back. The cub didn't bolt. Instead, it limped out, dragging one paw. Hunger had shrunk its frame, but the eyes held steady, a kind of defiance that felt familiar. James reached into his vest and pulled out half a protein bar. He didn't know why. He just broke it and held it out. The cub took 3 slow steps, sniffed, then snapped the bar out of his palm with surprising speed. That was the beginning. Unit regulations were clear, no personal animals. But war, James would later say, has a way of rewriting rules. What started as quiet visits became companionship. The squad called the cub Milo, a name James once heard in a childhood cartoon but couldn't quite place. Like a nickname for a fighter who doesn't know he's small, one of the guys joked. At first, Milo stayed hidden. He'd slink under James' cot, sleep in his duffel bag, dart away from loud voices. But gradually, he adapted. Like most bobcats, he was independent. He didn't seek affection. He chose when to stay close. He'd watch the soldiers during drills, follow them to the watchtowers at night, and sit still for hours, eyes scanning the dark ears, twitching at every sound. Over time, Milo began responding to James's low whistles. He learned basic directional cues, crouched at the sound of gunfire, and even growled when an unfamiliar vehicle approached camp. Whether it was instinct or imprinting, no one knew. But there was no denying the cat had bonded not to the unit, but to James. There's a photograph tucked in a box James hasn't opened in years. It's grainy, taken by an old point-and-shoot. James sits cross-legged on cracked stone helmet off uniform dusty. Milo, only 5 months old, but already lean and alert, is curled at his side like a sentinel. The caption on the back written in Sharpie, "My better half." Back then, no one called Milo a military working animal. There was no official title, no record. Just a wild creature who had found a place among men at war. But James never saw him as a mascot. Milo had this presence, not tame, not domesticated, just aware, like he knew more than he should. Maybe all animals know. Maybe they see something in us we try to forget. And the truth was, James needed him. By the second tour, things had changed. James had taken shrapnel to the left calf. He walked slower, slept less, woke up gasping, dreaming of narrow alleys and muffled screams. On one particularly bad night, after a roadside explosion killed 2 in their convoy, James returned to base, hands shaking. He sat in the dark, unable to cry, unable to speak. Milo pressed his head against James's knee and stayed there until morning. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't magic. But it was enough. In the following months, Milo began sleeping beside James's cot. His presence became routine, comforting, stabilizing, something to protect, something that expected James to get up each day. And when it came time to rotate out, James started asking about options. Could Milo be cleared? Could he be transferred? Could he come home? But this wasn't a rescue dog. This wasn't even a recognized species under military service guidelines. Bobcats are classified as wild animals, no handler records, no transfer protocol. James was told gently but firmly to leave Milo behind. There are many things no one trains you for after the war ends. How to sit still, how to sleep through silence, how to hug someone without flinching. But what broke James wasn't leaving the battlefield, it was walking onto that plane without Milo. He convinced himself it was temporary. that the base would care for him, that someone would step up. For a while, he believed Milo had been transferred to a sanctuary. But as weeks turned into months, calls went unanswered. A contact said Milo had been temporarily placed. Another said he was likely in a containment habitat. The words changed. The location didn't exist. No one could say who was responsible. The military had no paperwork. The contractors had no memory. And James? He had a duffel bag, 2 scars, a script for back pain, and a name he whispered to himself when the nightmares came. Milo. That name wasn't just a cat. It was his anchor. His reason. It's strange how animals teach us what it means to be human. James had never believed in soulmates, but he often said that Milo was the only one who ever looked at him and saw a person instead of a problem. Some people lose pets. Some lose brothers. James had lost both in one. And that's what made him start looking again. It began with old emails. Then he searched military forums. He posted anonymously in online groups for wildlife rehab rescue animals and former base workers. He joined threads about abandoned service animals. None mentioned bobcats. But one man, a former private contractor from Georgia, sent a cryptic reply. Try Cherokee Ridge. Old training site. Shut down. Some animals weren't cleared. That was all James needed. He packed a single bag, grabbed a flashlight, drove 6 hours into the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was mid-September. Rain tapped against the windshield like Morse code, and somewhere in those hills his companion was waiting. Or gone. But James had to know, because sometimes we don't choose to go back. We're pulled. By instinct, by memory, by a promise that still lives in our chest, even if it wears fur, even if it doesn't speak our language, even if the world calls it wild. James never cared, because that wild soul had once pulled him out of a pit no man could have climbed alone. And now, he owed him the same. He didn't know what he'd find in Cherokee Ridge. But the truth was uglier than even his worst expectations, and it was only the beginning. James Holloway didn't remember the flight home. He remembered the boarding gate, the stiffness in his back, the quiet handshake from a fellow Marine who couldn't meet his eyes. He remembered the seatbelt digging into his hip and the plane engine's hum. But after that, there's only haze. He must have landed. There's a photo someone took at the airport. James, in uniform duffel slung over one shoulder, standing under a welcome banner his sister made. His face was still, eyes unfocused, no smile. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt like he'd left something unfinished, like a chapter was torn out mid-sentence. Back in Asheville, the first few days blurred into one another. The house was too quiet. His dog tags clinked against the doorknob when he walked past. The fridge buzzed too loudly. Even the wind felt sharp, wrong somehow. He filled his time with routine early jogs through Bent Creek, checking fences around the property, standing too long in the garage, like he was waiting for someone to arrive. What he was really waiting for was a call. He had filed 3 inquiries before leaving base. 1 to the K-9 program office, 1 to a private security firm that had supposedly taken Milo in, and 1 to the admin branch on deployment records. He was told, "You'll hear back within 2 weeks." 2 weeks came and went, then 3, then 6. No word, no closure, just silence. So James picked up the phone. He started calling. The first few conversations were polite. "Thank you for your service. Let me transfer you. That's not my department." Then it became circular. "Try logistics. We don't handle exotic animal assignments." That wasn't a standard working dog. "Are you sure it was a bobcat?" He tried explaining, again and again. Milo wasn't a pet. He had served beside them. He responded to commands. He was field adapted. He had alert patterns, night tracking instinct, and had once sensed an IED before any equipment did. James wasn't asking for a favor. He was asking for accountability. But accountability was hard to pin down. Every call ended the same way, vague promises. "We'll escalate it. We'll get back to you." There's no official record of that animal being processed. That word haunted him. Processed. Processed meant listed, documented, assigned, which meant if Milo had never been processed, there was no official trail, no name, no responsibility, just absence. He switched tactics, started browsing veteran forums, typed late into the night on chatboards under anonymous usernames. Anyone know of animals left behind at FO Omega 2017? What happens to non-canine partners? One message came back. Just 2 lines. They say they get rehomed. They don't. Most go to contract shelters. Some vanish. James stared at the screen for a long time. That week he didn't leave the house. His appetite dropped. Sleep came in jagged waves. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Milo locked somewhere dark, confused, waiting. It's one thing to lose a companion. It's another to imagine them believing you abandoned them. That thought did more damage than combat ever could. So he kept digging, used old base contacts, messaged 3 Marines who'd served with him. One had moved to Oregon, another had left the country. One replied with a single sentence, "I heard they transferred animals to a holding center in Georgia before shutdown." He chased that lead. Found nothing official, just rumors, blog posts, broken links. Until one night, buried in a 2009 article about defunct military contracts, he saw the name Galen Ridge Animal Behavior Facility. No address, but he recognized the name. It had come up once casually in a contractor's voicemail he recorded months earlier. He dug through old files, played it back. There it was, faint under the static. They used to send non-standard cases to Galen Ridge. He ran a background search. Nothing. It had no active website, no state business license. But a Reddit user mentioned it in a 4-year-old post about unethical animal rehab. He traced the location to an old industrial complex north of Cherokee, NC. The next morning, James packed a flashlight, a pair of gloves, and a crowbar. He didn't call ahead. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just went. The road twisted upward like a coiled rope. Pine trees grew thick on both sides, crowding the shoulder. As he drove deeper into the hills, cell reception dropped to 0. A rusted sign barely clung to a post to Galen Ridge. Staff only. The gate was off its hinges. What waited inside wasn't a facility, it was a graveyard. Empty cages, molded tarps, a reception area with shattered windows, animal carriers stacked like trash. Silence, and that awful sticky smell of neglect. He moved slowly, breath held, listening for anything. That's when he heard it, a soft clink of metal. He followed the sound behind the last storage shed into a clearing where weeds grew waist-high. There, beneath a tarp-covered enclosure, was a kennel. Inside it, bones wrapped in fur. The cat didn't move, didn't blink. James didn't speak. He crouched low, waited, watched, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered clicker, something he'd carried in his vest for 3 years. He pressed once. The sound cut through the air like a spark. The bobcat's ears twitched. James whispered, "Milo." The cat lifted its head, slowly, as if dragging the memory out from a long-forgotten corner of its mind. One eye swollen shut, the other focused. Then a low growl, not angry but uncertain. James opened the door, stepped inside the cage, and sat down on the concrete. He didn't try to touch him, just sat and whispered. He told him stories about Asheville, about home, about how sorry he was, about how they were going to fix this. He stayed until dark. When Milo finally crawled forward and rested his head on James's boot, James broke. He didn't cry like a soldier. He cried like a man who'd lost his only thread back to who he once was and just found it again. There's a lesson hidden in that day. A small, quiet one. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just about showing up. It's in the digging, the asking, the refusing to accept that silence is a final answer. James didn't go to Cherokee as a hero. He went as someone who'd lost enough not to care what people thought anymore. And in doing so, he uncovered something bigger. Because when he posted that first photo, Milo's battered body curled in the kennel chain still latched to his leg, the internet didn't stay silent. It didn't turn away. It erupted. James thought finding Milo was the hard part. But what happened next showed him how many others had been left behind and how far people would go to protect the truth. There was a moment standing in front of that broken-down kennel when James wasn't sure if the bobcat inside was alive. Milo didn't move. His body was all angles, ribs sharp, hip bones jutting out like broken wings. One paw curled awkwardly beneath him. His fur, once a thick wild amber, was now matted with grime. A fly buzzed past James's ear. He didn't blink. He stepped forward slow and deliberate. A low metallic rattle, just the faint sound of the chain shifting as Milo stirred, broke the silence. James dropped to his knees just outside the wire. "Milo," he said gently. "It's me." No response. He fumbled through his pocket, pulled out the same battered clicker he had used in training years ago. Click, click. Nothing. Then, on the third try, Milo's ears twitched. Not much, just a flick, but it was enough. James whispered the German cue for sit, the one he'd used 100 times during night watches. "Sits." His voice cracked halfway through. Milo lifted his head. Barely. One eye opened cloudy and dim. Then a faint sound so soft, James wasn't sure he'd heard it, a whimper. A broken sound, like the echo of trust trying to resurface. And suddenly James was back in Iraq. Back in that base tent, back in the silence between gunfire when it was just them and the dark. His throat closed, his hands shook. He crawled under the top and into the kennel. Most people would have hesitated. James didn't. He slipped his arms under Milo's frail body, careful not to tug the chain. The cat flinched at first, then went still, as if something deep inside recognized the warmth. It took effort to lift him. He was lighter than he should have been. Bones shifted under fur. Milo made no sound. James wrapped him in a blanket he kept in the truck, drove straight to the closest vet he could find. No signal on the mountain, no GPS, just instinct and a memory of a clinic he passed on his way in. 30 minutes later, he carried Milo into a small-town veterinary office on the edge of Clay County. The receptionist gasped, "Doctor." Elena Pierce was in her late 60s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with hands that moved like she'd seen it all. She didn't ask questions, just motioned him into a room. As she examined Milo, James stood by the wall, fists clenched at his sides. "He's malnourished," she said calmly. "Severely. Skin infections, possible internal trauma." She touched a scar along Milo's flank. "This isn't environmental. This was caused by pressure, maybe restraints." She paused. "These don't look like accidents." James stared at the floor. "Are you saying—" His voice trailed off. "I'm saying this animal was treated like equipment." Her words were soft, measured, used, then stored. James's jaw tightened. Dr. Pierce added antibiotics to an IV, cleaned the open sores with steady hands. "He needs recovery," she said. "But more than that, he needs familiarity, someone he trusts." James stepped forward and placed a hand gently on Milo's side. The bobcat didn't move, but his breathing slowed just slightly. "He's got me," James whispered. That night, James slept in the back of the truck, Milo wrapped in blankets beside him. The engine stayed off. The stars above were wide and cold. Every so often, Milo would shift groans softly, then settle. James didn't sleep much. He kept watch like old times, but this time the danger wasn't outside the wire. It was the silence. The fact that no one, not one single person, had come looking for this animal. Not the handlers, not the contractors, not the agencies that had issued the transfer. No one. Milo had been dumped, forgotten, like gear that no longer functioned. That was the hardest part to stomach. Because Milo wasn't gear. He wasn't property. He was a survivor, a fellow soldier. And now, just like too many veterans, James knew he'd been discarded the moment he became inconvenient. 2 days later, James posted the photo. He hadn't planned to. He wasn't seeking attention. But something about seeing Milo lying there, too weak to lift his head with that old collar still digging into his neck, it snapped something inside him. He opened his laptop, uploaded the image, and wrote one line beneath it. "This is Milo. He served beside me in Iraq." And this is how they left him. He didn't hashtag it, didn't tag news stations, didn't ask for sympathy. He just shared the truth. Within an hour, there were 20 comments. By the end of the night, 200. By morning, 5,000 shares. Most were outrage. Some were disbelief. A few veterans shared their own stories. Service dogs lost in the shuffle, emotional support animals denied entry back home, wildlife companions euthanized by policy. One former handler wrote, "We were told they'd be taken care of. We believed it. I see now. I was wrong." Another said, "That Bobcat saved you, and now you're saving him." It shouldn't take going viral for people to care. That's the thing about rescue animals, especially wild ones. They don't just survive, they remember. And Milo remembered. 3 days into recovery, he flinched less when James approached. Day 5, he licked water from James's fingers. Day 8, he lifted his head when James entered the room. There's something beautiful in watching an animal come back to life, not in a dramatic moment, but in the quiet milestones, a blink, a shift, a breath that isn't strained. It's a reminder that healing isn't loud. It's patient, it's earned. James didn't know what came next. He had no blueprint, no plan, but he knew one thing: if Milo had been forgotten, others had too. And that was a weight he wasn't willing to walk away from. Because this wasn't just a wild cat rescue, it was a reckoning. A soft, quiet uprising led by a bobcat with half a tail, a scarred eye, and more courage than most people James had ever met. We think forgetting is harmless, that if no one notices, it doesn't matter. But forgetting, especially of those who gave everything, isn't just neglect. It's betrayal. Wild animals don't belong in war, but sometimes war chooses them. And when it does, we owe them more than silence. Have you ever wondered what happens to the animals that serve humans after we're done with them? James thought Milo's healing was the end of the story. But the photo changed everything, and what started as a rescue would soon ignite a nationwide movement. It started with one image. Milo collapsed in a threadbare blanket, one eye swollen shut, fur patchy, bones pressing against skin, a chain coiled loosely around his paw like a cruel bracelet. The caption was simple: "He served beside me." This is how they left him. James didn't expect much. Maybe a few shares, maybe some sympathy from other veterans. He posted it because he didn't know what else to do. By morning, the post had crossed 10,000 shares. By noon, it had doubled. The comments were a blur of outrage, heartbreak, disbelief. "This is unacceptable. Who let this happen? No warrior, human or animal, deserves this." It was as if the internet, for one rare moment, agreed on something. Veterans chimed in, first men and women who'd held working dogs while bleeding, who'd lost animals in combat, who knew exactly what it meant to depend on something non-human for survival. Then came the wildlife rescue community. Animal rights groups, journalists, people who'd never met a bobcat in real life, but recognized the look in Milo's eyes, exhaustion, betrayal, and the smallest flicker of trust. Someone tagged a celebrity, then another, and another. A singer known for wildlife advocacy reposted the image with, "He saved a soldier. Now, let's save him." Within 48 hours, James was receiving calls from reporters. They wanted the story, not just of the bobcat, but of the system that let him fall through the cracks. At first, James hesitated. He didn't like cameras. He didn't want to be a spokesperson. But every time he looked at Milo, curled in the corner of the room, still flinching at sudden noise, he remembered that there were more like him. Somewhere. Forgotten. So he said yes. The first interview took place in his backyard. No lighting crew, no makeup, Just James, a worn flannel shirt, and Milo resting quietly beside him wrapped in a navy blanket. The interviewer asked what Milo had done in service. James didn't talk about missions. He talked about the night Milo sat next to him for 6 hours after a close friend died. He talked about the time Milo growled at the exact second James was about to step on a buried tripwire. He talked about the way the wildcat would follow him at a distance through patrol, never interfering, just watching, always watching. He wasn't trained to do this, James said, voice steady. He chose to. That clip aired locally, then nationally. By the end of the week, the Forgotten Cage, as the story became known, was a trending topic on social media. Commentators debated the legality of keeping wild animals in military zones. Experts weighed in. Wildlife specialists discussed the cognitive capacity of bobcats. Animal psychologists spoke about trauma in animals, especially those used in conflict zones. But under all of that, under the noise and headlines and reaction videos, was something quieter, something deeper. People were remembering their own animals. A retired nurse commented, "This made me think of the cat who waited for my husband to come home from deployment. He never did, but she waited by the window every day for years." A young woman shared a photo of her late golden retriever who used to lay his head on her chest during panic attacks. "He saved me more than any therapist." The story had become more than a news cycle. It had become a mirror, not just about how we treat animals, but how we remember loyalty, how we assign value, how quickly we move on when something can't serve us anymore. And then came the hard questions. Reporters dug into old defense contracts. One article revealed that Galen Ridge, the facility where Milo was found, had previously received funds as a transitional habitat for non-standard military animals. But after a restructuring oversight shifted to a private contractor, that contractor had filed for bankruptcy 2 years prior. No one had ever retrieved the animals. Most had no record. When asked how many creatures might have been abandoned in that handoff, a former consultant replied, "Hard to say. These weren't canines. There was no standardized protocol." James read that quote twice. Hard to say. The same phrase had been used when he asked about Milo. It was more than bureaucracy. It was erasure. And people noticed. Petitions launched. One demanded federal policy requiring lifetime tracking and care of all animals used in military service, wild or domestic. Another called for a review of how non-canine animals are logged in field reports. Within days, signatures crossed 500,000. Congressional representatives issued statements. One called for a hearing. An animal law nonprofit offered pro bono counsel to help James establish guardianship of Milo and prevent him from being classified as wildlife property. A wildlife rehab center offered support. Someone anonymously mailed James a check for $25,000 with a note for Milo. For the ones we forgot. James kept going. He stayed by Milo's side, fed him every 3 hours at first, cleaned the wounds, monitored his tremors. He didn't care about the news, or the politics, or the sudden flood of media interest. He just wanted Milo to eat on his own. Day 10 he did. Day 14 he took his first steps toward the door without help. James cried quietly behind the counter so Milo wouldn't see. There's a lesson in how fast something can be forgotten and how quickly it can be remembered when someone refuses to look away. We assume systems work. We assume someone else is checking the list, logging the name, sending the form, but sometimes they aren't. And what's left is silence unless someone fills it. James didn't want to go viral. He wanted answers. What he got instead was a movement. It's easy to think of war as something humans endure, but animals serve beside us. Sometimes without consent, sometimes without recognition, and in their silence they carry our burdens too. Milo didn't choose to go to war, but he stayed. He watched, he protected, and in the end, he waited. That loyalty deserved more than an apology. It deserved change. Example takeaway. When a video of Milo walking again, a little unsteady but proud, was posted by a small wildlife account. It was shared 2.3 million times in 3 days. The caption, "He remembered." And so did we. If you believe animals deserve more than a thank you, share this story. But while the world talked, James and Milo quietly prepared for the hardest chapter, yet healing the wounds that no headline could see. By the 3rd week, the headlines had cooled. The interviews slowed. The phone stopped ringing. The world had moved on, but Milo hadn't. He still didn't eat without help. He still flinched at sounds James couldn't even hear. He still circled in his sleep like he was back in the cage, unsure which direction was safe. The viral moment was over. Now came the part no one ever wants to film. The quiet. The slog. The rehab you never see. James never left his side. He turned the guest room into a low-lit sanctuary. Soft bedding, blackout curtains, quiet jazz on loop. He placed bowls of water in every corner, humidifiers to help Milo breathe easier, and a heat lamp above his bedding. Not because Milo asked, but because he deserved comfort. James kept a journal. Every small change, every shift in Milo's posture, he wrote it down like gospel. Day 17. First tail flick while watching birds outside. Day 19. Ate 1 full chicken strip without coaxing. Day 22. Flinched but didn't run when I opened the fridge. Day 25. Sat beside me for more than 5 minutes. None of it was dramatic, but all of it mattered. One morning, James was late coming into the room. He'd overslept for the first time in weeks. When he opened the door, Milo was standing. Not pacing, not startled. Just standing. Head tilted, eyes alert, waiting. It wasn't much, but it felt like being forgiven. He walked over slowly. Milo didn't move. James sat cross-legged on the floor just like he had in that cage weeks ago. He didn't speak, just breathed. Milo stepped forward, touched his nose to James's knee, and walked away. Not far. Just enough to say, "I know who you are now." That day, James wrote in the journal, "He doesn't hate me. He's still here." Dr. Elena came twice a week, checked vitals, updated meds, brought liver supplements and soothing balm for the paw scars. "You're doing everything right," she'd say. James always asked the same question. "Is he going to be okay?" And she'd always give the same answer. "He already is. He survived." What she didn't say, but James understood, was that surviving didn't mean restoring. Milo wouldn't be the same. His gait had changed. His hearing was diminished. His left eye had permanent damage. His reactions were slower. But the Bobcat had something else now. Stillness, not the fearful kind. The kind that comes when you finally understand that no one's going to hurt you anymore. Around week 6, Milo started exploring the yard. At first, he stuck close to the porch, moved cautiously, ears tuned to every rustle. James would sit on the steps, coffee in hand, pretending not to watch. Milo would sniff the bird bath circle, the oak tree, then retreat. But by week 9, he'd roam a little further. Sometimes James found him perched on the fence, staring into the woods like he was remembering something no one else could see. Once during a thunderstorm, James jolted awake in the dark. The boom had pulled him back to somewhere he didn't want to be, back to sand, to explosions, to a time when no one felt safe. He was frozen in bed breath, shallow fists clenched under the blanket. Then a sound. Soft, deliberate. A weight landed beside him. Milo. The Bobcat climbed onto the bed, not pacing, not circling, just laying down, pressing his side against James's. They stayed like that until morning. It's easy to talk about rescue animals like they're fragile, like they break and you fix them. But James was learning that rescue went both ways. He hadn't realized how numb he'd become, how quiet his world had gotten. Milo didn't just need care. He brought back rhythm, ritual. He gave James a reason to get up, to notice the small things again, how the trees sounded at dusk, how the porch creaked in the cold, how peaceful it was to sit in silence with another living thing. There was one day in particular, a sunny Thursday. James had just finished trimming the hedges. Milo was curled up on the porch swing, watching the wind play with a few dry leaves. James walked over, sat down slowly, and began to hum an old tune. Not for any reason, just a habit he picked up years ago in field camps. To his surprise, Milo began to purr. Not loudly, just a soft, steady vibration. James smiled, reached out, and placed a hand gently on his back. In that moment, he wasn't a war veteran, and Milo wasn't a wild cat rescue. They were just two tired souls, finally at peace. There's a small lesson hidden in all of this. Rescue isn't a one-time act. It's a decision you make every single day, to show up, to try again, to sit through silence without demanding answers. James thought saving Milo would be the hard part. He was wrong. The real work begins after the cage opens. People often asked in interviews, "Why didn't you take him to a sanctuary?" James always gave the same reply. He didn't need a sanctuary. He needed someone to stay. Wild animals are often cast as symbols of freedom, untamed, independent. But what Milo taught him was something deeper that even the wildest hearts still long for safety, for recognition, for a place to return to. Milo never lost his edge. He was still alert, still cautious, but now there was something else. A choice. A quiet agreement between them. You don't have to be anything. You just have to be here. James began to share updates sparingly. No filters, no music, just short clips. Milo stretching in the sun. Milo touching his nose to a flower. Milo watching the rain. The comments returned. "Thank you for showing this side. I didn't know bobcats could be this gentle. I thought animals like this couldn't be saved." Each message reminded James that people were still listening even if fewer were talking. It wasn't viral anymore, but it was real. And maybe that's what matters most. Not every rescue story ends with fireworks. Some end with a nap on a porch swing. Some never end at all. Because healing isn't linear, it's layered. And the ones who truly love animals, especially wild ones, know that it's not about fixing, it's about honoring who they are even after they've been broken. A bobcat learning to trust again might just teach you how to do the same. If you've ever seen yourself in the eyes of an animal, share this story with someone who needs hope. But Milo's healing wasn't just a quiet victory, it was preparation. Because the moment he stepped into that small town store, the world would witness what true loyalty looks like. It was a Saturday like any other. James and Milo had fallen into routine morning walks, quiet meals, slow afternoons on the porch. Life was simple again, predictable in the way only healing can be. On this day, James needed coffee and jerky, and Milo, as usual, insisted on riding along. The town was small, the kind where folks wave from their porches and the same clerk has worked the corner store for 20 years. James pulled into the lot beneath an old oak tree. Milo sat upright in the passenger seat, alert, but calm the way he always was on rides. His fur had mostly grown back. His eyes were clearer, now focused. His strength had returned, but the wildness, that had changed. He was no longer a creature surviving. He was choosing to stay. James gave his head a soft rub. "Be right back, buddy." He stepped inside. The bell above the door gave a soft chime. He waved to the cashier, grabbed a basket, and headed to the back cooler. Then it happened. The door opened behind him. A man walked in, hood up, shoulders, tense hands shoved into the front of a thick jacket. He wasn't local. Something about the way he moved didn't fit. James noticed the cashier stiffen. Then the man shouted, pulled a gun. Panic surged. Everyone on the ground. James dropped behind the aisle end cap. His instincts kicked in, scan, breathe, calculate, but there was nowhere to go. The man grabbed a little girl near the counter. She couldn't have been more than 6. He held her close, shaking, yelling. The store fell into chaos. Screams, movement, crashing sounds, but outside Milo was watching. What happened next wasn't loud. There was no roar, no growl, no drama, just purpose. Milo leapt silently from the truck. He'd watched James walk into that store 100 times. But this time was different. He heard the screams, and that was enough. He trotted across the lot, unlatched the door with a practiced push, and slipped through before anyone inside could notice. Not a single bark, not a hiss, just stillness moving forward. James saw him, just a flash of fur along the cereal aisle. Then impact. Milo launched from the ground, not to kill, not to maul, just to disarm. His body struck the assailant from behind. The man's arm jerked, the gun dropped. The girl screamed and bolted. James stood and rushed toward her, scooping her into his arms as the man stumbled, tangled in Milo's limbs. Milo didn't bite, didn't claw. He pinned. Perfectly. The way he had learned years ago under the cover of desert stars and command cues. The store went silent. By the time the police arrived, Milo was sitting calmly beside the subdued man, tail sweeping the floor, gaze fixed on James. News travels fast in small towns. By sunset, someone had already uploaded the security footage. By morning, it was on the news. A former military Bobcat saves child in armed robbery, the headline read. They called it instinct, training, luck. But James knew better. It was choice. Milo had seen danger, and despite everything he had suffered, everything he had endured, he still stepped forward. The footage went viral, again. But this time it wasn't pity that drew attention. It was awe. A Bobcat, calm and precise, not acting from fear, but from focus. Comments flooded in. "This is the most incredible animal video I've ever seen. Who knew wild animals could show this kind of control? Rescue animals never forget. They repay love with loyalty." Wildlife rescue groups released statements praising Milo's restraint and awareness. Animal behaviorists analyzed the video frame by frame. One said, "This is a masterclass in animal discipline. You don't train this without a deep mutual bond." For James, it was personal. This wasn't just about an animal defending a human. It was about what came after rescue, about how trust once broken could be rebuilt so fully that it became action. Milo didn't lash out because he was wild. He intervened because he remembered what James had done. Because that connection born in war, tested in captivity, healed in silence, was still alive. There's a lesson in there. Redemption doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in quietly, does what needs to be done, and waits for the world to catch up. Milo didn't want attention. He didn't need applause. He simply saw someone in trouble and responded. Not as a symbol, not as a pet, but as a companion. The little girl came to visit 2 weeks later. Her name was Lily. She brought a picture. She drew stick figures of herself, James and Milo, with the words, "Thank you for saving me." Milo sniffed the drawing, then nuzzled her hand. James teared up. Her mother, teary herself, whispered, "I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't been there." James said only, "He was meant to be." People often misunderstand animals, especially wild ones. They assume they're unpredictable, dangerous, incapable of loyalty. But those who've worked in wildlife rescue, who've walked side by side with forgotten or abused animals, know different. Trust doesn't make them tame. It makes them whole. And when you honor that bond, they'll return it in ways that go beyond instinct. James hadn't trained Milo to defend that store. He'd simply created a space where Milo felt safe enough to choose for himself. That was the real miracle. The sheriff's department issued a statement calling the incident an extraordinary case of animal intelligence and bravery. The store owner offered James a year's supply of free coffee. The town started calling Milo the silent hero. James just smiled. To him, Milo had always been that. It just took the rest of the world time to see it. Not all rescue animals need to be fixed. Some simply need space to remember who they are and to be given the chance to prove it. The same animal left to die in a forgotten cage became the protector of a child, the pride of a community, and a living example of what second chances can do. If you've ever doubted the power of animal loyalty, watch Milo's story again and share it with someone who needs to believe in redemption. But Milo's journey wasn't just personal, it became a mission. Because James realized if one bobcat could be forgotten, there were likely many more still waiting to be found. The letter came printed on heavy paper, embossed logo, government seal, a formal request. James unfolded it slowly, sitting beside the porch where Milo lay curled in the late afternoon sun. The words were straightforward. Would he speak at the National Companion Animal Service Summit in D.C.? Would he share Milo's story with those shaping future policy? He looked down at the bobcat beside him, now solid with strength, scarred but steady, and exhaled. Milo blinked once as if saying, "Do it." Milo had survived war abandonment, trauma. He had saved a child, quietly, without force, and James knew it was time for that story to become more than a memory. It had to become momentum. So James went. Not because he wanted the spotlight, but because he now knew the truth. Milo wasn't the only one. In D.C., James met others. A former army vet who'd spent months tracking down her service dog, only to discover he'd been reallocated to a contractor in a neighboring state. A wildlife handler who spoke of mountain lions, briefly used in border security trials, then later discarded due to budget cuts. A marine biologist who testified about dolphins trained for naval ops and quietly shelved when they aged. And then there were the ones who couldn't speak for themselves. Rescue animals left behind, wild and domestic, who had served in silence and were forgotten just as quietly. It hit James hard. Milo was the face, but not the only story, and that's when the idea began to take shape. Back in Asheville, he started mapping. Names, contacts, abandoned shelters, decommissioned kennels, private contractors with expired licenses, forgotten trails. He pulled together a small team doctor, Elena Pierce, 2 fellow veterans, and a part-time wildlife legal advisor who'd seen the story go viral and reached out. Together, they built a mission, not just a rescue, not just a shelter, a movement, Milo's Echo, named not for the animal himself, but for the ripple he started. A non-profit built to locate, retrieve, and rehabilitate service animals, especially wild or exotic companions that had been lost in the shuffle between deployment discharge and policy gaps. The goal was simple. No animal that served should ever be forgotten. The first rescue came within 3 weeks. A retired K-9 with early-stage PTSD, left at a closed-down contractor site in Arkansas. Then a fox named Saul, once a part of a behavioral research unit, now blind in one eye and living in a basement enclosure. Then Pepper, a scent-trained ferret used for mine detection in arid terrain. A little thing with a chewed-up ear and a twitch that never stopped. Each came with their own file, their own backstory, their own pain. But when they arrived at the facility, Milo's old rehab space now expanded with private enclosures and roaming areas. They were met not with cages, but with care. Soft lighting, familiar scents, gentle voices. And Milo, he'd greet them from a distance. Never dominant, never territorial, just present, just there. As if to say, "You're safe now. I know what it's like." People started noticing. A local journalist visited the site and published a quiet, powerful piece titled, "The War We Don't Talk About: Animals Who Served." That story sparked a second wave of interest. Donations came in. Some small $5 here, $10 there. Others surprising. A family foundation in Ohio. A retired general, a children's book author who pledged proceeds from her upcoming story on animal companionship. But the moment that truly changed things came when James received a voicemail from a woman named Marcia. She had a soft voice, uncertain. Her husband had died 2 years ago, retired Coast Guard. He'd spent his final months looking for his old partner, a golden eagle used in wildlife surveillance missions. He never found him, but when she saw Milo's story, she felt something shift. "I don't want anyone else to go through what we did," she said. "If there's anything I can do," James called her back. Within a month, Marcia was on the board of Milo's Echo. The small lessons came fast. Every animal had a timeline. Some healed in days, some took months, some never truly adjusted but found a rhythm anyway. Every handler who came to volunteer, most of them veterans, carried their own ghosts. Some didn't speak much, but they showed up early, stayed late, sat with the animals in silence, and began slowly to come back to life themselves. Because that's the truth most people miss. Sometimes the ones we rescue end up rescuing us right back. One evening, James sat beside Milo beneath the pines. The breeze carried the smell of early fall. Across the field, Saul, the one-eyed fox, darted between leaves chasing shadows. The ferret Pepper was curled in her hammock, twitching in sleep. And nearby, a new addition, a hawk named Bramble, rescued from a failed contractor aviary, preened carefully under the fading sun. James looked at Milo stretched out beside him. "You started all this," he murmured, without saying a word. Milo didn't move. Didn't have to. His presence was enough. That was always his gift. Not noise, not obedience, but presence. Fresh perspective. Legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's built in quiet gestures, in persistent work, in a ripple that starts with one act of compassion and becomes a wave of change. Milo never asked for recognition. He simply lived loyally, fiercely, and fully. And in doing so, he became something rare, a symbol that stayed real. Today, Milo's Echo supports rescue efforts in 5 states. They run trauma-informed training for wildlife partners. They host therapy weekends for veterans and first responders, pairing them with animals in recovery. They give forgotten warriors on 2 legs and for a place to rest, to heal, and to remember that loyalty still matters. They don't make documentaries. They don't post every success, but the work continues. Quietly, steadily. One rescued life at a time. What started with one bobcat in a cage became a safe haven for dozens, each with a story, a scar, and a second chance. If you believe no animal who served should ever be left behind, share Milo's Echo with someone who needs to hear it. Years passed, seasons changed, but Milo's Echo kept growing. And when the time came for him to rest, he left behind something deeper than a legacy. He left behind a way forward. It began like any other morning. The lake was still, the sky a soft gray before dawn. James walked the trail slowly, coffee in hand. Milo padded beside him, his gait slower, now more measured. The years had added silver to his muzzle, a haze to his eyes, but his presence was unchanged, steady, watchful, deeply there. They had done this walk hundreds of times, but this morning felt different, not sad, not heavy, just complete. They reached their usual spot, a clearing by the edge of the lake where the sun first broke through the trees. Milo sat. James sat beside him. No words were needed. He watched the bobcat breathe in the crisp air, blink slowly at the soft movement of water, and lower his head onto James's boot. And in that moment, James knew. He didn't panic. He didn't cry. He just sat still, hand resting gently on Milo's back as the morning opened around them. Later, he'd bury him beneath the tallest pine near the porch. No stone, just a carved wooden marker shaped like a paw print. The others gathered around, vets, staff animals, each in their quiet way, honoring what he had meant. It didn't feel like losing a pet. It felt like saying goodbye to a guide, a companion, a mirror. Because Milo wasn't just a bobcat. He wasn't just a rescue animal. He wasn't just a viral hero or a wildcat who saved a child. He was proof that even the most broken can find their way home. In the months that followed, James kept walking that trail. Sometimes alone, sometimes with one of the newer rescues by his side. One in particular, a young German shepherd named Ridge Nervous Reactive, rescued from a failed canine training center, had started following James from room to room, never quite settling, until he was sure James wasn't going to disappear. One morning, Ridge followed him all the way to the lake, paused, looked up, then sat exactly where Milo used to. Not as a replacement, but as a continuation, a reminder that echoes don't fade. They move forward. There's a lesson hidden in the quiet parts of this story. Not the viral headlines or the heroic takedown, but in the way Milo chose to trust again, to forgive, to live fully even when every reason said not to. That's what makes animals so remarkable, especially rescue animals, especially wild ones. They don't just survive. They remember, they teach, they reflect back to us the things we've lost or forgotten how to carry. Loyalty, presence, courage, grace. Milo never asked to be a symbol. He just was. And because of that, Milo's echo still lives on. Dozens of animals now walk free because of him. Veterans who once sat in silence now sit beside foxes, hawks, ferrets, and bobcats, learning healing, remembering that they're not alone. And James, he no longer carries his past like a weight. Now he carries it like a banner. Quiet, steady, grounded in something real. We often talk about the human capacity to love animals, but rarely do we speak about how deeply animals love us back. Not in the way we expect, not in tricks or obedience, but in the way they stay, the way they wait, the way they show up, especially when we no longer feel worthy of being seen. Milo never spoke a word, but he said everything James needed to hear, and maybe everything we need to hear too. Here's what we often forget. Wild animals aren't wild by choice, and rescue animals aren't broken. They are survivors, witnesses, carriers of stories we'd rather not face but must. When we take the time to truly care for them, to listen to, stay to rebuild the trust someone else shattered, we become more than caretakers. We become the people they believed we could be. James once wrote in his journal, "Milo didn't save me with heroics. He saved me by staying, by not leaving when I did, by waiting even after everything." And maybe that's what real love looks like. Not what happens in the moment of rescue, but what happens every day after. If you've made it this far, maybe part of you has felt what James did. Maybe you've known what it's like to be forgotten, or to forget someone you shouldn't have. Maybe you've loved a creature who showed up for you in a way no human ever could. Maybe you still think about a pet who's no longer here. One you whispered to at night. One who waited by the door. One who never gave up on you even when you had. That bond, that sacred connection, it doesn't fade. It becomes something else. A legacy. A light. An echo. So today, ask yourself this. Who in your life has stayed even when they didn't have to? Who have you helped heal, and if there's a creature, animal, or human you still carry in your heart? What would it mean to honor them with action, because the world doesn't just need more stories. It needs more people willing to live the kind of story Milo lived. Silent, brave, loyal, alive in the truest sense. If this story touched something in you, pause. Breathe. Think of the ones who've walked beside you. Then, when you're ready, share this video with someone who still believes in second chances. Like, subscribe, leave a comment if you've ever been rescued by a creature with 4 legs, 2 wings, or even a wild heart. Because Milo's gone now, but his echo, it's still moving. And maybe it just reached you. What happens when loyalty is forgotten, when the ones who served silently, fiercely are discarded the moment they're no longer useful? This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. And it starts with a single haunting moment. A Marine returned home and found his bobcat chained and forgotten what he did. Stunned awe. In this deeply emotional and true inspired narrative, we follow James Holloway, a retired Marine struggling with trauma, grief, and the emptiness that comes after war. But nothing prepares him for the silence that follows one simple question. Where's Milo? Milo wasn't just any animal. He was a wild cat, a bobcat raised in a combat zone, bonded by survival, trained by circumstance. And when James discovers that his closest companion was abandoned, left to rot in a cage behind a shuttered facility, He doesn't walk away. He begins a journey. What unfolds is a powerful tale of rescue animals, second chances, and the fierce unspoken bond between a man and a creature the world called wild. If you're still here listening to this little bobcat's journey, thank you. If you'd like to help support stories like hers, that little super thanks down there goes a long way. This isn't your typical cute animal video. This is about the forgotten, the discarded, the voiceless. It's about what we owe to those who served, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. It's about how healing doesn't come with headlines. It happens slowly in small victories, quiet mornings, and unwavering companionship. If you've ever lost a pet, questioned the system, or needed to believe in animal rescue, emotional video stories that truly matter, this is for you. This is the kind of story our viewers watch late at night, sometimes in tears, whispering to themselves, This is why I still believe in kindness. Featuring powerful themes of wild animal rescue, post-service trauma, and the healing power of love. This documentary is more than content. It's a voice for those who can't speak.